All right, I'm Mark Christiansen with Wood and Window. So I've given a number of presentations for CPF and architects before, but never on wood, only about windows, for instance. And I should start by telling you a quick funny story. One time at a CPF conference, I was introducing myself to an architect, and I said, I work for Wood and Window. We make wood windows. And she just looked so perplexed at me, and I was like, the name is pretty simple. We don't do metal windows. We don't do vinyl windows. And she just kept looking at me really funny. I'm like, what am I not getting across? And she said, I've never seen a window not made of glass. So I'm not talking about glass. I'm going to talk about wood. And I should say that I don't have a forestry background. I don't have a biology background. But I am going to talk a fair amount about wood as the material. And then as we get into it, I'll talk more about architectural woodwork elements. I'm not going to talk about posts and piers and things like that necessarily. And then we can go through some examples of how we can repair wood. So just to set it into context, so I'm the weakest link of everybody that's presenting today. So this is sort of a chart of life expectancies of buildings. And you can see that concrete, steel, and masonry far outpace wood structures. But again, I'm going to talk a little bit less about the structure itself and talk more about the wood elements. Okay, that's fine. I think it will. No, it doesn't. Yep. So you probably saw from the title of the presentation, it all starts with a tree. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a tree, just because we're not, none of the other people are going to talk about the volcanoes or the mountains that their stuff comes from. But since mine started out as a living structure, we should start by first talking about that living structure, just so that you can understand a little bit about it. And it's important to set it up, too, as we get into some of the discussions about durability and preservation and restoration of wood. Again, another funny circumstance I've had recently was I was talking to a builder about the wood that we use, and he said, Mark, you're not going to tell me that God has started changing the way trees work and whatnot. And I said, no, it's not God, but it is how we grow trees, and it has changed the durability to a great extent of the type of lumber and the type of wood we're getting from those trees. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. So as we peel back the layers of an onion, if you will, or peel back the layers of a tree, when we look at stacks of lumber, we rarely understand the context in which that wood is. And you'll hear terms like heartwood as being the strongest and most durable. Well, guess where that is? That's in the center of the tree. And obviously, as you get further out towards the bark, the wood gets weaker and weaker. It's less durable. It's much more about the growth that's taking place in the tree as opposed to the stability and longevity of the tree. So here's a cross-section of a log. Kind of easiest to see it on the top left one before we dissect it. But does anyone know where rings come from? Why are they these dark lines and these light lines? Seasons, yeah. Summer wood versus winter wood. And it's really what creates those lines. And so the darker lines were basically where the bark shed off in a previous year. Still leaves kind of a dark line there. And then we've got an expansion of growth. And so you hear oftentimes, both in specifications for lumber, especially when you get into the structural side of things, is they talk about rings per inch. In other words, the wood that you're dealing with, how many rings per inch is it? Because if you have a tree that's growing very, very fast, you'll have lots of growth taking place from one year to the next, and those rings will be stretched further and further apart. This is going to be difficult to see, but you can see it when you all come up later. But this is a vertical grain fir, and I haven't measured it, but it's probably somewhere in the ballpark of 25 rings per inch. So very, very old growth. Took 25 years for this tree to grow, 1 inch in radius, 2 inches in diameter. 25 years, but very, very slow growing compared to lots of trees that we probably even have in our neighborhoods. Juxtapose that to, this is a piece of pine, happens to be a treated piece of pine, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but you can see there's maybe 4 rings per inch as we look at the cross-section of it. So very, very different structurally, very, very different from stability and even longevity standpoint. And we'll get into that in a moment. Where did I put the clicker? You said I was going to lose it, didn't you, John? So again, you can see here that heartwood is centralized, and sapwood is more towards the outside. And it becomes important to understand when you're looking at the structure of wood, are you dealing with heartwood or are you dealing with sapwood? And so we do see some specifications that oftentimes are calling for just heartwood, which, as you can look, it's the smallest part of the cross-section of the tree. We're not going to get very large boards, even in very big trees, that are cut, sliced through all heartwood. Oftentimes you'll see some sapwood and some heartwood together because the piece of lumber, which is a rectangle, is being cut out. I think we've got a new slide that talks about this. Yes, okay. So this talks about typically how do they end up milling logs, and the most important thing is to understand what is happening with these boards relative to the rings. Plain sawn is the most common. Can anyone guess why? Most efficient. You get the most lumber out of that circle. Since we don't use oval boards, we use rectangular ones. It's all about how much can you get out of the slicing through those logs. Live sawn, kind of an interesting concept. It's cutting all the way across. Typically, we would only see this in artwork or maybe in carvings, perhaps in some interesting tables and furniture, but typically not in structural. Rift sawn, quarter sawn, very popular within certain types of woods. Oak, for instance. These happen to be pictures of oak right here. So let's see if I can figure it out. So for instance, with the quarter sawn, we're getting much, sorry, which way is it? Trying to see where the line is in this. 1 second. I think what it's emphasizing here is that the quarter sawn is not out in the sapwood. It's much more dealing and concentrated with the heartwood here, whereas rift sawn is much more focused on the outer rings and therefore is going to be more sapwood. In general, they look quite common. They look very similar. Vertical grain is what we're seeing here, but it's more of a concentration of how much of the outer rings versus the inner rings is it coming from. Typically, for siding and exterior grade, we'll see applications where it's flat sawn or plain sawn out here, where as you look at the end of the board, it'll look like a rainbow, for instance, because you're being sliced from the outer sections of the log. And on the face, it looks like kind of weird, varying widths, because what's happening there is you're cutting at an angle across the grain. If we look at either the quarter sawn, rift sawn, or vertical grain, when you look at the face of the board, it looks like nice, tight lines that are all very parallel, unlike the other side. And when you look at the end of the board, they're nice, tight, straight lines as well. We're not seeing the rainbow effect. The reality is the reason that in architectural millwork we don't use the flat sawn is it can cup, for instance. It can warp more easily. It's mostly because you've got varying grains that are exposed, both the winter grain and the summer grain, and therefore those absorb water differently, expand differently with heat and cool, and you'll get a cupping effect. When you're dealing with vertical grain, very stable, not a lot of movement, no cupping. So the vertical grain and the quarter sawn and the rift sawn tend to be much more around structural architecture millwork. Flat sawn tends to be more when you need nice wide boards. It's okay if it cups. You certainly wouldn't want to put it on a horizontal surface where it's going to potentially pool water, for instance. So let's talk a little bit about just timber and durability in general. So this particular chart was created as a group was doing testing of raw wood stuck into the ground. So sort of the worst scenario possible. And it's really hard to read up there, huh? What's a wood that people know that get used quite commonly in the Bay Area? Redwood. All right. On redwood earlier. Now I got to. Believe it or not, it's not in class 1 most durable. Whoops. Wrong way. So the most durable is in the top right. And about the most common wood you would have heard of up here is teak, for instance. Has natural oils, even has sand in it. Very, very durable. Redwood, I believe, falls into class 2, actually. So again, sitting in the ground by itself, untreated, 15 to 25 years. What's another common wood people know of? Doug fir, yep. So Doug fir, it ends up as in class 3. So only moderately durable. One of the things about Doug fir that makes it more durable than other softwoods is the amount of pitch content that's in it, the sap. That is actually what gives it its water durability, for instance, which becomes a problem when you go to finish it because the pitch can come out through the finish. So the thing that makes it a very durable wood also makes it very difficult to deal with paint finishes and whatnot. The lion's share of the wood that we use in architectural millwork in the Bay Area is sitting down in this class 3 area. So most windows and doors, exterior trim and cladding is down in this class 3. Class 5 and class 4 are pretty much just for interior woods. Birch, alder, poplar, things like that. So those are, because of their durability, they're not meant to be used outside. Okay? Any other popular woods that people want to find up there? By the way, Western Red Cedar, no one mentioned that one. That's a very popular alternative to redwood, and that happens to be in class 2. Oak and maple. Maple, I believe, is over in class 4, so not great for exterior. Oak is actually listed in class 3. So from a wood perspective, it's quite good. And I'll talk, and please remind me if I don't bring it up later, about why we don't necessarily use it with windows and doors a lot, because as we get into some other elements about lumber, I'll comment on why it's not necessarily great in water situations. Yes, question? Water, right. Yeah, correct, yeah. This doesn't necessarily talk too much about insects and durability with that. We'll talk about that in a moment, but the reality is insects only go where there's lumber and moisture and air anyway. So if the wood is able to collect moisture and hold it, insects are potentially attracted to it. So one of the reasons why teak and redwood, for instance, are very resistant to insects is because, I did it again, because they're in that class 1 and class 2. They're just not absorbing that much water. they're much more durable. So yes, this is durability to water. This test and classification was based upon sticking the wood in the ground. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Expensive, also not necessarily used in architectural millwork. So teak is used a lot for siding and decking. There's another wood that it's difficult to read up there, ironwood. These are, yes, very durable woods, but very difficult to work with. You can't build architectural things out of them. They're made for sculptures and decking and siding and things like that. So yes, so the reason that we're down into the class 3s of doing things is because these start to be more woods that are more millable. So it is important to consider where is the wood that you're dealing with in the building. Are you dealing with paneling and moldings and trims, carvings and whatnot on the inside of the building? Or are you dealing with cornice work on the exterior of the building? Are you dealing with the siding and the windows and doors? And windows and doors have two sides to them. They have the interior side and they also have the exterior side. And so it's important to understand where is the wood within the proximity of weather. So typically there's sort of an understanding that there's a progressing class of hazards. Obviously, the closer you get to the ground or being in the ground, the more hazard it is to wood. But there's also sort of a gray area, if you will, where it depends upon whether you've got overhangs, whether you're dealing with patios and decks and places that are protected by protected from direct interface with the weather, but still are outside and can get moisture. The other thing to understand too is things that are on the inside, especially of heated buildings, the wood will retain a very small amount of moisture. If you then were to take that wood outside and it would start to collect moisture, or if you exposed it to air from outside or cold temperatures, all of a sudden it might start to change and crack and expand and contract at a different rate than it was used to for the last 100 years in the building, for instance. So water in and of itself doesn't hurt wood. What it is the organics that happen. So fungus is, we'll see some examples of that in a moment. But it's a living organism, and it needs, like most living organisms, water, air, and a food source. Take one of those things away, chances are it's going to go away too. So the reason I was mentioning the durability relative to water of the woods is some of the woods, because they're not collecting water, they're taking away the one element of fungus and one element that the insects need as well. One of the examples I have up here actually has 3 different woods in it, some more durable than others, and they all were decimated by the fungus. Because once it established itself in one area, it was able to grow and attack in a different way these other woods that wouldn't normally have been attacked. 3 common types of insects that we deal with in the Bay Area. Typically, we're just dealing with termites. In the Central Valley, sometimes we get into beetles. They typically like warmer climates than necessarily what we have here. And actually, in the Bay Area, typically we have subterranean termites. So you might not see them when you're walking around the building. It's only when you start crawling underneath the building that you see the evidence of them. Oftentimes you can see the evidence down there, but by the time it gets up to the first floor, it's buried inside of the wood. Even just looking at it, even poking at it, you might not detect that there are termites there. They're actually inside of the boards at that point. It's only downstairs where they're bridging the gap from going from the earth into the wood that you can find the trails by poking at it. So oftentimes it's quite an exercise to follow the termite trails through a building, and you'd start from the bottom up. So we'll talk about some treatments that can be done to, again, either cut down on the water or cut down on the food source for these guys as well as for the fungus. So this is a typical example of a post, for instance, that is halfway underground and halfway above ground. So you can see that it's the moisture content in the ground that allowed the infestation to happen there, and it's very much isolated there. Let me show you a couple examples that I've got up here on the table of what are some other examples. And again, you can come up and see this in a few minutes as well. This is an example of part we took out of a house last week. I think the window is probably 25 years old, not very old, an older home. The sill is made of Western red cedar. You can see what's happened to it. There's a slice of Douglas fir that was attached to it, the sill, just to give it more of a shelf. And the jamb leg here is made of oak. You can see the fungus really didn't care what the wood was. It attacked it all. And the challenge with identifying this oftentimes is this was a fixed window here, so there was a window sitting here. We could see evidence of some damage to the sash, which is the part of the window that holds the glass. But until we actually took it out and could see the large hole in the corner, we weren't sure really what the damage was. But you can imagine if this is the window and it ate all the way through it, the fungus was actually into the framing below the window as well. So it started at the sash, it ate through the jamb material and the sill material, and actually went down into the framing below as well. This wasn't insects, this is just fungus. So we'll talk about some of the chemical treatments that can be done to arrest this. It can't necessarily repair it though. Yeah, so probably what happened was the glass allowed water to get into the wood frame, the wood sash, which eventually then leaked through the joints in the sash. Because this was a fixed window, the water was trapped in there. Someone probably came along and painted and caulked the outside, thinking that that was the problem, which just further trapped the water inside of the wood at that point. And so eventually fungus took over, found a way out. Another example here. Typically a lot of failures in old buildings too with wood take place at the fasteners. So what happens with old nails when they get wet? We're talking about it relative to plaster. Well, what happens when it happens with wood is the nail disappears due to rust, and now you've got a pocket for water to sit in. And you can see the stain marks there, for instance, of what starts to happen with the wood once the nail fails. And later you can take a look at the repairs that someone tried to do to this old sash here with some nails, and you can see the type of damage that actually took place after the fact due to the nails being shot into the wood, which then again gave a way for water to get inside of the wood. So a lot of the building trade elements get into how do you fasten wood, how do you do that in a way that doesn't necessarily promote water intrusion. So what can we do either ahead of time with new wood, or in the case of some of these bad parts, to stop the infiltration or prevent it? So one of the popular ones used, in particular in the warmer climates here in California, is to put borate sticks in. So they look kind of like the fertilizer sticks you'd put into your garden, but we basically drill them into the wood, insert them, and then cover them up. So they're basically left stuck in the wood to, if they get wet, they're able to leach out some of the chemicals and cause, one, fungus to not grow there, and two, beetles and termites don't like it. Not necessarily a toxic chemical at all. It's, mined out in Death Valley. All of these other ones start to get into levels of toxicity, and typically, the green and chrome-based or copper-based ones are typically only put on lumber when it's going to be in contact with ground, when it's going to be in contact with moisture all the time. when it's going to be in contact with some place where termites can easily get to it. So it's typically not the types of preservatives that we would use above ground or in millwork. For those, one product we use is made by a company called Woodlife, and they have a water-based, no VOC version of it that we can use in California. Some of the challenges with these preservatives in general is the state of California doesn't allow them to be imported in bulk or even used in some cases. So that's causing some of the challenges with the preservation and use of wood within California, for instance. But we do have a water-based one. I'll have to look up the exact product name, but if you go to Woodlife, you can look up their product line, and one of them is a no VOC version that can be used in California. So, if you were to go out and do a search for wood preservative, you're going to find lots of things. The issue is many of them either can't be bought in California, shipped to California, or bought in bulk in California. So you have to be very careful when you get into the specifications and when you get into use of preservatives that there's something that can actually be used in your jurisdiction. Like I said, these, anything that has green or the word copper in it tend to be those ones that are used mostly for wood in contact with water all the time. Obviously can't be used on stain grade things either. It does stain the wood and turns it green. It's sort of the classic old green boards that you're used to seeing from the lumber yards. Let's talk a little bit about wood repairs. So you don't have to replace wood, a piece of wood, for instance, when it's been eaten away or when it's damaged by something else. By the way, a lot of times, even on interiors of buildings, the damage isn't water or bugs or things like that. It's humans. It's the use of the building. A very common one with windows is the hardware. Just about in every school window I've ever seen, that's a double hung window that lifts up and down. There's a little latch that you flip to lock the top and bottom sash together. I don't know why, but for some reason school children and teachers like to open the window a little bit and flip the latch so it's quote unquote locked. What happens then is if you lift the window up, it eats every piece of wood it comes in touch with because it was meant to lock the window at the check rail. Well, typical school windows in California had multiple lights above. They had buttons like this that divided the light, that divided the glass. So what happens is as that lock gets lifted up, it bashes and breaks every single one of them all the way up. So we're currently doing a project at Berkeley where every single window isn't rotted, but every single window has been bashed and beat up on the inside by that lock having been thrown and the window opened. So are we replacing the window? No. Are we replacing an entire piece of wood? No. Somewhat like we were talking about in the plaster world, we're using similar types of compounds to do repairs on the wood. So one important thing to understand is, are you going to be repairing wood that does have fungus in it, that does have dry rot in it? If so, that has to be corrected first. And so some of these products that I have up here, you first have to start with a liquid version, a penetrating chemical that's going to lock in and seal the fibers of the wood before you can then start to put fillers on top of it. By the way, we all use the word epoxy a lot. Epoxy is just a general chemical description of something that requires two things to be put together, one of them being a catalyst that causes a chemical reaction to take place. I have up here examples of lots of epoxies, but only one of them is a liquid epoxy that's meant to be penetrating. All the others are epoxies that are fillers and dry hard and can be tooled and carved and routed and shaped and things like that. So do be careful that when you're using the word epoxy, are you talking about a liquid penetrating preservative epoxy, or are you talking about a wood filler and hardened epoxy? I wouldn't recommend in any preservation project using something that isn't an epoxy. In other words, it should be something that requires the combination of two things together to cause a chemical reaction to take place. So a simple wood filler that you buy at Home Depot and scrape out of the can and put on and it dries when it's in touch with the air, no, that's not an epoxy. It requires the mixing of two chemicals together. The mixing of either two liquids or two pastes. There are some of them that are sold in a caulk gun that come in two tubes, and as you squeeze it, there's a spiral and it rotates it together. Very similar things are used with concrete as well. So do make sure that the products that you're specifying are an epoxy, a two-part system. So the first is, so this happens to be Arbitron product. So also I would recommend that you choose products that are mixed 50-50, that don't require someone to have measuring cups or something like that in order to mix it. It's much easier when it's a 50-50 thing. So this product is a penetrating epoxy. So you do scrape out the loose wood, you do scrape out the rotted wood, and then you apply this on top of that. It usually does take 24 to 48 hours to harden. So again, these are not situations where you can go and just patch something in a day. You're going to first scrape it out. You're then going to apply a penetrating epoxy system that's going to take 24 to 48 hours to harden. You're then going to take an epoxy filler. Again, you're going to combine two pieces of, typically it's a paste substance. And as you mix it, and we can practice that if people want to do that, as you mix it, it's going to cause a chemical reaction to take place. Some of them further require moisture to be involved to help along with the chemical process, but they don't all. But hardening then takes place very quickly with some of the products. Some of the products, though, need another 24 hours again before you can actually sand it and tool it. So this is Arbitron products, for instance. It can be bought in bulk, or for small projects, it can actually be bought in a kit. So small box comes with enough to do probably a room's worth of windows and issues like that, where it's got both, literally it's got gloves in it, it's got spatulas in it, it's got squeeze bottles in it, it's got everything you'd need, including the chemicals. The other product that we use a lot of is Smith's, local company out of Richmond, and they focus on the marine industry, and so they have a marine-based, again, penetrating epoxy, and then a fillet product that's used for the filler. Another very popular thing to use is Bondo. Yes, it's the same thing that's used on cars to fix damage and crashes. And basically the main compound comes in a gallon size, and then there's a small creamer that you add it. That's the catalyst. It dries very fast. It dries in 5 minutes and can be sanded immediately. Whereas these other products that are more focused on longevity and also require the initial penetrating epoxy to be used take much longer to dry before they can be tooled. So here's an example of what a typical process would look like. So you've got a particular joint where water has infiltrated it. You're going to put the liquid epoxy on first and let it harden.
A quick question.
Yep.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yep.
Somebody's asking if epoxy is effective in repairing partially rotted logs in log cabins.
Partially rotted logs. So again, the first thing is to stabilize by making sure that the rotted parts are taken out, the loose fibers. You then would use it to penetrate. Yes, absolutely. You can use the penetrating epoxy to harden the pieces. But then would be a question as to whether you then want to build it up or not. All of these products here that I'm talking about do have a color to them. You wouldn't use them in a stain grade application, for instance. You'd only use them in a painted application. Yeah. But yes, penetrating epoxy. We've used penetrating epoxy as the final finish on some stain grade materials. So the penetrating epoxies all are clear. You can't tell when there's one unless you actually cut into the wood, and you can see, sort of a liquid discoloration, if you will, in the first, eighth to a quarter inch of the wood, depending on what kind of wood it is. But it looks like a varathane or a clear-coated finish when it dries. So you can see here, we're not looking to, actually one of the challenges that people often get into when they're using these fillers is they think, well, I'm just going to put a small amount so I can sand just a smaller amount off. The reality is because it's a chemical reaction taking place, they want it to be more. You don't want just a small, tiny amount. The more you put on, the more the chemical reaction and the harder it will get. But again, you can actually get it down to sharp corners. You can actually run a router across it and do shapes and profiles and things like that. Personally, for a lot of the window and door work we would do more like a Dutchman here, in order to get a wood corner and a wood end. And typically we will use fillers only on the face of things, for instance, or at a corner, for instance, on the sill that I showed, where it's going to be totally hidden anyway. So what is a Dutchman? So a Dutchman is actually taking out a piece of wood, taking it back to good wood, so taking all the bad wood out. You're not, therefore, then using necessarily any of these epoxy products. You're going to then put a new piece of wood in and sand it out to make it look like it was the original piece of wood. To the SOI elements, typically it is required to use the same wood as the original species, which does get into challenges. We were talking about redwood earlier. It's very challenging and very expensive to deal with redwood oftentimes. We have had a number of projects over the last couple of years within the Bay Area that are starting to be a little less rigid because of the God-changing trees problem. Because the lumbers that were available 100 years ago just aren't as readily available. Or if they are available, they have those wider ring counts. They're coming from farms as opposed to old growth natural forests, things like that. And it just isn't practical anymore. We did a project over at the piers in San Francisco. The original windows were pine. We were required to use pine again, along with a bunch of preservative put on it. Normally, I would not use pine for any project right now. It was only required because we needed to use the same original wood species that was in those windows. So, basically, here, just a simple example of cutting out existing parts. Here it's showing literally a saw blade being used to cut a simple one, and then a simple square piece of wood being put back in. We have worked on projects before where someone wanted a more distinctive shape, or because the repair was at the edge of a joint and therefore they wanted a bow tie shape to be inserted instead to give it a little bit more structure and rigidity. Also, depending upon where in the structure it is, the challenge can become the wrong way. We've got a butt joint here of the end grain of wood connecting to the end grain of another piece of wood, which is a very challenging splice to happen. The expansion and contraction that takes place in the wood can happen right at that joint, causing it to open up over time. One of the things that they are using here is a different type of glue. It's a urethane-based glue. And you'll see in the next slide, well, it's a little bit difficult to see here, but it's literally oozing out, kind of like an epoxy. It's oozing out of the joint and then needs to be sanded. So it gives it a little bit more structure, a little bit more rigidity at that end grain to end grain connection of these two pieces of wood. But done correctly, these are virtually indetectable once they're all sanded out and painted. So this is a popular way of replacing larger pieces. Again, you're not going to put a tiny little piece of wood into a structural element because that tiny little piece of wood will never have enough glue or never have enough connection capability to the old wood. So it's a balance of when do you use a filler product versus when do you use a Dutchman and wood replacement piece. Any questions about those two elements? We have been seeing classifications coming out recently where architects will say which category of repair are they looking for. It used to be, well, are we looking to replace or are we looking to replace a member? Now we're starting to see more and more specifications where it's use a filler versus a Dutchman versus a piece replacement versus a more of a sash replacement. Yeah. Okay. Right. 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 Sure. Right. Yeah.
Can you quickly repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. So the question is about how long will the repairs last, and pointing out perhaps the somewhat obvious, but yes, I'm not covering it, of what caused the problem to begin with. Where did the rot come from? Where did the failure come from? Sort of what was the root cause of it? Is there a leak somewhere? Is there a bad gutter or roof or grading problem, things like that? Yes, those need to be addressed first. This isn't. None of these products will stand up longer than the original product, even in the face of a failure taking place in the building or at the job site. You have to first address where did the water come from, or how were the pests getting into it. You then look at how can we get it back to the way it used to be before the damage started taking place. Yeah. We're talking about right. We've been talking about fillers and things like that. Right. When it gets into member replacement, so replacing a bottom rail, replacing the leg of a jamb, replacing the dividing mutton bar, in those situations, you need to replace it back with the same joinery that was used originally, because otherwise you're causing all the pieces around it to be compromised as well. And again, when people come up, I can show you an example of what took place on this one particular window here, where someone tried to use a different mechanism for replacing a piece, and you can see it not only eventually caused that piece to fail, but all the pieces around it to fail as well. Yeah. So it's not just about the lumber, it gets into how are you protecting it. I'm going to ignore for a moment the first two columns of, sorry, next slide. On this one, so this one is about which type of lumber are you using and for what applications. So earlier I mentioned oak, which rated quite high on the durability scheme of things. But one of the problems with oak is, one, it's really bad at holding paint, the worst one on the chart. And two, it has this conspicuous problem called checking. What is checking? Well, checking is when wood gets wet, it will start to have some fissures and cracks in the surface. One of the most annoying places that oak gets used is on sills that are a horizontal surface that collect water. And when a check happens, water is now sitting inside of a small pool in that piece of oak. The most durable wood cannot have a hole in a pool sitting in the middle of it, even a piece of redwood. So again, it's, oak would be great for siding, for instance, where the checks aren't going to matter so much. By the way, you probably want it to be painted, and it's not very good for that choice, right? So you've got to understand these mixes and interplays of where is the wood being used, what kind of wood is it, how is it being treated, and preserved, and things like that too. So these do require you to understand the mix and mesh of these different requirements together. Let's pick one of the other ones. Earlier I mentioned Western Red Cedar is a great alternative to Redwood these days. You can see it up at the top. Ranks very high, very high in paintability and resistance to cupping, and has no checking of the surfaces, for instance. You can also get it in a vertical grain orientation, kind of like this piece of fur I had, where it's very stable and can be used in doors and windows and millwork where we want it to not warp. What's another common wood? Redwood was down here with the same ranking as the Western Red Cedar. Douglas fir, not so good at holding paints. And we mentioned that pitch issue earlier. And it does exhibit some checking and cupping problems as well. The softwood. What's another one? Well, we already talked about oak. So, and in general, a lot of these are classic exterior grade woods, yet some of them have problems with painting and some of them have problems with checking. And again, checking isn't necessarily a problem in a vertical scenario where water isn't going to be sitting in it, but you don't necessarily want to use it for a sill or a horizontal scenario or a water table trim scenario where it can have water sitting on it. So one of the questions that people are often exploring is, how often do I have to update the finish on my wood? Well, part of it depends upon the finish and part of it depends upon the wood. So often the right-hand side, we can see how long can we expect the coating to last on various different types of woods. The best one here is 7 years. The best one here is saying you better be repainting it in less than 7 years, or you've lost the protective coating on that wood. Where's another common one here? Let's see. We were talking about pine earlier. Pine is 3 to 5 years. Quite often. A lot of painting. One of the products that we use for flat panels much more than we do plywood these days is a product called MDO. It's basically used on outdoor billboards and things like that. It can't be used in a stain grade application, but in a paint grade application, it gets as high as 8 years before it needs to be painted again. So it's basically an MDF type product, but with the glues and woods that they use, it gets into a much more durable exterior coating. This one's about clear coats. I don't know how much, typically people are using these on interior applications. Again, the biggest challenge we have these days is what chemicals are available in the state of California or for LEED projects where you're getting down into no VOC scenarios and you're getting into water-based clear coats. They do perform pretty well. And obviously do have the benefits of being no VOC. There's just some application differences to them that the painters need to be aware of in terms of what materials they need to be using to put them on. So that's the end of my slide set. We can come up here and I can show you a little bit more about sort of face-to-face with some of the damage that can take place. And then if people want to try mixing up some of these epoxies and see what's involved with some of the different ones, there is different consistency between them. There's different smells associated with some of them, as well as you can take a look at some of the warning labels and things like that on the products too, because those are important ones to understand with the projects, depending upon, again, the circumstances or the ventilation and things like that are involved in the projects. Also, we can look more closely at some of the grain rings. One thing I will mention too is I didn't point it out specifically on that durability slide, but back on that very first slide that talked about durability, one of the class 1 durability woods was Akoya treated wood, and that's what this happens to be. So they actually use either alder or pine, which natively are not durable at all. They're especially alder is typically an interior grade wood, but they put it through a molecular process that changes the molecules and makes it so that it doesn't expand and contract the same, doesn't absorb water. This is one of those pieces of wood that we could set in a water bowl and it wouldn't change at all. Yet it can be used in a stain grade application. Yes, a slightly different color than someone might expect it to be, but have had projects that have used it in stain grade applications. It's basically some sort of heat and water-based process that causes literally the molecules to change. It's not a chemical process. It's not like you know, the pressure-treated lumber and things like that we see where they're you know, injecting and pressure treating chemicals into it. That's not what this is. Literally, we could cut this in half, and it would be just as strong cut in half as it is this way. And you can see, you know, the consistency all the way through it looks the same. It's not like it's got some just surface preservative around the outside face or anything like that. No, sorry, like I said, I'm not a forestry major, but no, they explain it in excruciating detail on their website. Yeah, Thermowood and Akoya are two different brand names. It's not a different type of wood. They tell you what type of wood it is natively, but it's just a molecular process change that they put it through. Okay, yeah. The trees haven't changed. How they grow has changed, right? So the big difference between old wood versus new wood is truly what is involved with how fast the tree is growing. If it's growing on a plantation, it's all about production. In other words, they're trying to grow as many trees as fast as they can. It also gets into because trees are living things. If you've ever planted a garden and planned a garden, typically you want things to be planted very, very closely together, and then the ones that thrive you leave, and the ones that are having trouble you take out. So very densely populated places, such as naturally growing forests, have that Darwinian effect going on where the strongest are surviving and the weaker ones are being weeded out. Plantations, depending on how they're managed, may not be managed in that same fashion and form. But typically, if we were to go to, so this is vertical grain fir, Douglas fir. You can buy Douglas fir at Home Depot. It won't look anything like this. It won't look anything like the number of rings. The number of rings will be much more like this piece of Akoya pine here, which is about 4 per inch. Whereas literally this is more like 20 per inch. So this is from an old growth tree, not necessarily redwood, you know, it's fir, but it's from deep in a forest somewhere that was intentionally logged out and brought out and sold to architectural millwork scenarios, if you will. So there are only a few places on the West Coast that specialize in this kind of lumber and this kind of foresting. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Just telling a story. And it was in the old executive office building. I was very proud of it. Got Foxmeyer's Golden Fleece Award for the most frivolous use of federal funds.
Okay.
All right. I'm proud of that. But anyway, there was a cherry floor they had ripped up, and we had to go find 100-year-old cherry match,
right,
which we ultimately found.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's all these things, like water logs that have been underwater,
right,
in
right,
Lake Superior, and there's all. So I'm just curious about wood.
Yeah. So the whole reclamation and reuse industry has become quite popular over the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years. So literally trolling through rivers, going, here in the Bay Area, going back into the mountains and valleys of Big Sur and finding trees that fell 50 years ago, and maybe they could never get to them or didn't have the right, mini crane systems and whatnot to pull them out and log them. Those sorts of things are starting to take place more. Obviously, there's the whole scenario, too, of old barns being taken down. And many times, people aren't necessarily using the timbers the way that they look, although that's kind of a style as well. In some cases, they're being resawn would turn into quote unquote sort of standard lumber and being reused. Another one that we see is old water tanks. Saw one recently that it was made of olive trees and redwood, old tanks and marin and things like that, where the number of rings, the stability of the wood was just amazing. So the reason that the tighter the grain is, the tighter the ring count is the more stability is. You have less of that sapwood, less of that white wood, less of the summer growth, and therefore the differences between 1/4 of an inch to the next of the wood is reduced, and therefore the stability is that much better. You've got more homogeneity, if you will. Whereas when you get into the larger ring counts, 25%, and then it changes the type of wood again. 25%, then it changes the type of wood again, right? No, it still is critical in places where there are joints, so windows and doors. Would it matter on siding? Would it matter necessarily on even finished carpentry to a certain extent in a building? If you see the miter joint slightly open up on a vaulted ceiling, maybe it's not going to matter so much. But where you've got joints that need to stay tight, when it's being moved and things like that, then you do want that stability even if it's painted. I have yet to see a plastered door or window. That would be an interesting exercise, though, too. One of the things, too, about redwood is, unfortunately, it is a softwood. It does ding up and gets beat up pretty easily. So you don't see many redwood doors. You tend to see more redwood windows. Doors have corners and edges that are swinging open and closed all day long and bashing up against other pieces of wood all day long. And one of the challenges with redwood is it gets beat up. So if you want to come up here and we can take a look at it's hard to show you from your seats, but we can take a look at some of the damage that took place to this window.
How old was this window? 20 years?
No, this is probably 100. Yeah. Right, that one. So there's a couple different types of joinery that's used to combine the pieces of wood. This one uses mortise and tenon, and what that means is that the horizontal pieces in this case have a tenon on the end. You can sort of see it hanging out here. So they have a piece that's connected to the piece of wood, and it goes into a pocket or a mortise in the vertical piece. Either originally or at some point in time, someone said, well, geez, we've got these two pieces of wood stuck together. To stop them from pulling apart, let's shoot a nail into it. So, and for some reason on top of that, they always shoot the nail in the exterior face. I have no idea why. They do. So look what happened. The nails rust away. What's left behind? A hole for water to get inside. What happens when water gets trapped inside of this, what used to be a beautiful joint, very tight? It starts to rot it all away. The other area too that absorbs water the most in wood is the part that is in contact with the ground to begin with, where the roots are. It's called the end grain, right? So this particular piece of wood was oriented in the tree this way, which means that it's really good at sucking water in through what we call end grain. So what happens when this end grain is inserted into this tight little pocket that's got water coming in, cooling and sitting in there, it starts to pull water. Where is it pulling water? It's pulling water into this other member here. What happens when it gets water? It starts to expand. When it dries out, it shrinks back again. Well, when it shrinks back again, it's not like something is driving it to get back together again. Instead, it's expanded forever. It's forever now expanded out, and that's when you start to get joint issues and things like that. Again, someone decided, well, those nails didn't work. Let me throw some nails into the side. Well, the nails are left, but none of the wood is left now. So again, this could have been corrected if they'd used stainless steel nails or something that wouldn't have rusted away quite like this. But still, the evidence is there of repairs that have been attempted in the past and failed. They tried to use a different type of technique than was original. Original was just a wood-to-wood connection with some glue. Now they tried to introduce some metal into it, and it caused it to fail. We were talking about replacements and wood member replacements. One of the important things to understand there is and it's often difficult to tell when it's painted, right? This one's been stripped. So we can see where the different pieces of wood are. Might not have been able to tell when it was all together that these two vertical pieces here are two separate pieces of wood from the horizontal one that went across. So oftentimes on projects, we've seen requirements where someone said, oh, there's a failure, replace this piece of wood. Well, to replace this piece of wood, we have to take out these two pieces of wood, all four pieces of glass, to replace this one, to then put these back in. And all of a sudden, we're then reglazing all four lights too. A lot of times, when you don't understand the construction of these things, you think, oh, we're just going to replace this piece of wood here. That's only going to affect two pieces of glass. The reality is because this piece of wood is continuous all the way across, it's going to affect the whole window. So this is where you get into one of those scenarios of it can, one, be very, very expensive to preserve the historic materials. So many projects we have to do. But at some point, if economics is an element, you start to say, well, at what point do we just replace the whole window on something like this, where the damage was right here, sometimes due to that silly lock on the double hung window, it beat this piece of wood up. But these are one of the challenges that we see right now with surveys and windows and doors is that you see the failure, you see some damage, it's painted, you can't necessarily tell what the construction of the overall thing is. You think it's isolated and simple and straightforward to repair. It's not once you break it into its constituent pieces and try to figure out how those repairs are going to take place. Yeah.
Without knowing or discounting that you know the age of the building, how can you detect the age of that piece of wood versus that?
There isn't a good way to do it other than, one, you can look at ring counts, for instance. This one, I know the age because I knew the glass.
And I don't mean the age of the wood necessarily. I guess I mean the age of the construction.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So, okay, so look what was hiding inside of this piece of wood here. It's not even a nail, it's a staple. Staples have only been used in factory windows for the last 20 years.
So that's literally
yeah. And it's not even rusted. Yeah. So construction methods, woods used. So one of the interesting things here is I mentioned that there's two pieces of wood on the sill here. Again, you might not be able to tell until you cut into it, but a factory used a pre-stocked piece run by a molding company for their sill, and then they added this little adder to make it be quote-unquote custom. But the reality is on an original window, this would all be a single piece of wood. A little forensic stuff. And I've never seen, while I've seen oak sash, never seen an oak frame because of some of those situations we were talking about earlier where it's just not a great wood to be on the outside. So sometimes we'll see veneers. So we'll see that it looks like oak on the inside, but on the outside, we'll see that it's a different type of wood, pine, something like that. Veneering like that didn't happen more than 100 years ago. So immediately you can rule out that it's 1800s, if you will. If it's a real wood, now you're into probably 1950 or later. Or I'm sorry, 1950 or before, because otherwise they probably would have veneered the whole thing and had a core that was a particle board type product, right? So those are some ways to do it. But again, a lot of these things you can only do by cutting through it. So one other secret then is with windows, operable windows at least, there are some areas that are harder to paint and harder to get gooped up on than others. They tend to be the top or the bottom, right? When people paint, oftentimes they're just touching up the face. So one thing that we'll often do is we'll open the window. This is a double hung window, and we'll look at the top, or we'll sand the top, because now we're able to get through less coats of paint. Believe it or not, sometimes you'll hardly find any paint on the top or the bottom, and you can get a little bit better sense of what's going on with it. The challenge with some of the construction with the mortise and tenon is these pieces were all put together at the same time when the window was put together. So it's really not possible to go back and do the exact same construction without taking this window all the way apart, every single piece, and putting it all back together again with this piece being replaced. So oftentimes what will happen is we'll end up doing a slightly different type of joint here called a cope and stick, where it still is shaped at the ends to be the counter profile, if you will, to this style, but it won't have the tab that goes in. Because it's that tab that goes in that would require this entire thing to be exploded back into its constituent pieces and parts to be assembled.
When you do something like that, you add a dowel.
Adding anything in there, though, would cause the whole thing to have to come apart. Even if you couldn't insert a dowel unless you went through the outside. Right. Unless you went through the outside.
So it's just a glue joint?
Right, just a glue joint. Yep. And
no nails.
You would use nails, but only where the glass and the waterproofing will hide it. Yeah. So yep. So you toenail the nails in here, and the glass goes in, and the putty and waterproofing goes on the outside. So the nails are still never in touch with water. If the nails get in touch with water, then you've got water coming through and around the glaze. Do people want to try one of these products? Mix it up? So usually, literally, we'll take a piece of glass or a piece of wood to mix it on. Yeah, I got some too. So I prefer this particular product just because it's a little bit more flexible. So this is one of those products. Figuring out with a spatula. And literally, it's just kneading it together. Typically, they are different colors so that you can see. Not quite like baking. You can actually see the color differences here. Now, this particular one is one of those epoxies that I mentioned will take 24 hours to set up. So it's already very paste-like, like a thick frosting. But still, it would be wet to our touch. If we were to touch it, it'll smear, if you will. So we would just use it to fill in. And like I said, too, we're going to leave it high. And we're going to come back and sand it back later.
And you don't need to put your liquid?
Normally, we put the liquid first. Yeah. If I did that, then we'd have to wait until tomorrow.
There's a question from the online
people.
What is the barrier between the nails and the glass fabricated wooden frame sealed or primed before the glass is installed?
Yeah, so typically before glass gets set, you would prime any raw wood. There then would be a glazing compound or a caulk that's used to set the glass in. The nails shouldn't protrude though. So even though you're using nails, they need to be set in. Otherwise, even a small nail head, when it touches the glass, will cause it to chip. So the nails should be inset. But yes, you're always putting a glazing compound or a caulk system underneath the glass, as well as then on the exterior face between the glass and the outside of the wood too. So both sides of the glass.
Do you prefer a glazing cutting for the outside or
For the outside. For the outside, we would either use a wood stop that might be set in with a silicone sealant, or we'd use a glazing compound. It just depends on what the desired look is. Yeah.
Another question, follow-up question. What's your preference between oil or water-based sealers or primers?
15 years ago, I'd say oil all the way. The reality is so many projects now are, one, requiring water, two, the whole state of California, which is a big country, quote unquote, has moved towards water. And so finally, the chemical companies are starting to catch up. They're starting to get better systems, and it is starting to improve a lot. The durability, obviously the cleanup and the safety and all those other sorts of elements for the employees that are using it is much better with the water-based ones. I mean, they still can be poisonous, but they're not giving off the vapors and things like that the oil-based ones do. So this will actually take a long time to set up. Let me show you a totally different version. Let's look what happens when we use Carbondo. And yes, this is literally what gets used in automotive stores. And yes, this is literally what gets used at lots of projects dealing with wood around the country. So it will bond with wood and whatnot just as easily as anything as well as metal. I don't even know technically how much of the creamer you're supposed to add. I usually do it by color. It should be one of these per can. Oftentimes in our shop, it isn't that way. Yeah, you can buy it separate. Yep. So basically, it'll end up being kind of a light colored pink. Put it on the carpet, Mark.
And that has a smell.
Yes, and it has a smell. Yes. Next time we go into your automotive body shop, you will you will recognize this smell.
Time for that to set up again.
This will be about 5 minutes. It's going to be really fast.
You have to be quick. You can't mix it up too much. You have to do small batches.
Yes, you have to do small batches. Yep, yep. Literally, in our factory, we're using small things like this. On job sites, you're using small things like this. Because literally, it's you're applying it to a spot, and then you're moving on to a next spot and mixing it again. Earlier I was commenting too on when do you do a Dutchman wood repair versus when would you use a filler. You're not gonna fill a section like this, for instance. It's too large, and they don't work well doing it a layer at a time either. It's not like plaster or patch or wall patch where you can do it in a few layers and build it up. They're not meant to be used like that. They're meant to be in touch with the wood, solid, and then sanded and shaped off later. So we'll come back to that in a couple minutes, and it will be hard.
How do you decide whether to use Bondo or the more traditional wood?
Our rule of thumb is we only use Bondo on interior, and we use the marine-based ones on exterior. So it could be that on this one window, we might use one versus the other. On the inside face, we might use Bondo. On the outside face, we use marine. But the reality is, too, is it gets into the timetables of the project, too. Again, we're talking about multiple days, talking about weather windows, all those sorts of scenarios that can happen on some types of projects, too. Obviously, something that can be done in a day sometimes is the way you have to do it. And again, I would say that it's probably a difference of, are you dealing with a horizontal surface like a sill, or are you dealing with a vertical face where water isn't necessarily ever going to be sitting on it?
Mm-hmm.
This one, so this was off the Renoir Hotel, San Francisco. And again, you can sort of see the one, very tight grains, all redwood. So the rings are very close together. But you can see the damage that started to take place from the rest of the nails and water intrusion starting to happen there, just the discoloration. And then down here, of course, you can see how big the holes start to get once the nails disappear and the pieces start to move around. And again, water gets inside and starts to rot it away from the inside out. Right? We're talking about areas here where you're not doing the paint finishes. You can't get to them. So once water starts getting in there, there's nothing that you can do other than taking it apart, correcting it with things like penetrating preservatives, and then putting it back together again. What we're doing here. Okay. Already starting to firm up here. Yeah, it's strong. Whereas the other one, still, tacky like taffy or frosting. And this one will remain like this for at least a couple hours before it starts to harden up. This one, we could literally sand probably in another 5 minutes. So again, chemical reaction taking place. This isn't it reacting with water or air or anything like that. It's literally these two chemicals. You know, this canister, I could take the lid off and it would be just fine for days and weeks. Nothing would happen to the contents inside. But combine them together, and all of a sudden it's a different reaction that's taking place. Right? Any other questions?
No